Okay, hear you. Welcome to all who are here. My name is Paul Weiss. I'm a professor in the history department doing anthropology and history. And I'm here today in my capacity as director of the Center for the Arts and Society, and most importantly to introduce James F. Brooks, who will be presenting us with a talk entitled Connecting with Indigenous Communities Through Indigenous Art Collections. I always like to begin by just saying what the Center for the Arts and Society is. Its mission is to serve as a kind of crossroads or interface between the arts and humanities at Carnegie Mellon. It's an organization that exists through the active involvement of faculty members in the schools of art, drama, and music, the departments of English, history, anthropology, and modern languages, among others. The Center is thus by definition an interdisciplinary, or better said, transdisciplinary enterprise, and that's one reason why today's event and speaker are exciting for us. I should introduce James, but I should do so by explaining all the ways in which I have come to know him and some aspects of his work, which is hard because he's done and continues to do so many different kinds of things. One graduate student in my seminar who met with James earlier today said, just say etc. a lot. So if I say that over and over again, it's just, because I have to. The first way I came to know James and would like to introduce him is through his scholarship. James's book, which I have in my bag, I should brandish it. I'm not going to do so, I'll just pretend I am. Captives and Cousins, Slavery, Kinship, and Community in the Southwest Borderlands, which came out with the University of North Carolina Press in 2002, correct? A radically innovative book, I think we can safely say. Its topic, the emergence and transformation of a captive exchange economy in the Southwest Borderlands, from the 16th to the late 19th century. In it, Brooks introduces us to not one but many borderlands with different social and physical geographies, all of which refuse easy identities, conclusions, and rubrics. Here, if you take some of the keywords in his title, slavery, his discussion of slavery is quite novel. His focus on the borderlands, first of all, rather than the eastern and southern United States. And he focuses on a constellation of indigenous, Hispanic, and mixed race groups, rather than African or African descended. Most importantly, he looks at a kind of economy of capture and slavery that was not based upon chattel slavery, say on a plantation model, but rather based on radically different kinds of practices and a radically different history, which is, that strikes me as enormously important to remember and recover. So the vision of this kind of slavery and capture that James presents us with in this region is integrally related with practices of capture and exchange and frameworks of honor and shame of long precedent in both indigenous and Spanish cultures long before the conquest. He integrally relates practices of capture and enslavement both between indigenous groups and between groups of European, indigenous, or mixed descent to patterns of economic exchange and commercial activity, pastoral and otherwise. And a key feature of the study, and again something that sets it apart, I think, is his study of kinship in this context, hence Captives and Cousins, the title of this work. In other words, those who are taken as captives or slaves were typically thought of as potential kin, and often over time were incorporated into the capturing group. There are profound implications of this work for the analysis of the forms of community that emerge in the borderlands. James' book suggests how complicated questions of community formation and definition become in such scenarios, whether for Spanish, Hispanos, Apaches, Comanches, or any number of other indigenous or mixed race groupings, for instance, the Iniceros. And finally, he gives us his discussion of violence is critically important. He gives us a very affecting picture of systemic low-level violence, or what he called in our seminar today, low-intensity peace, which do not reflect a breakdown of social order or institutional control, but precisely a pattern of production and of social reproduction that lay at the heart of the making of borderland society, et cetera, lots of other important and interesting things here. For me, the book is impressive for its interdisciplinarity, drawing upon the methods of social and cultural history, also comparative history, for instance, drawing upon the work of Africanists on forms of capture and exchange, environmental studies, geography, cultural anthropology, archaeology, ethnomusicology, et cetera. And of course, this work has not gone unrewarded. Many prizes, more than 12 major awards in 2003. A few of them are the Bancroft Award from Columbia University for works in history of the Americas, Francis Parkman Prize from the Society of American Historians, the Frederick Jackson Turner for Best First Book in American History, the Erminie Wheeler Vogelin Prize from the American Society for Ethnohistory.
We're getting there.
James's new book project, Mesa of Sorrows, Archaeology, Prophecy, and the Ghosts of Awahawaii of the Pueblo, which is coming out with Norton, is a sort of a micro-history of a massacre in 1700 of the Hopi community by fellow Hopis. In it, James will present us as a sort of a Rashomon tale of varying perspectives, drawing on the tools of the historian, of historical archaeology, and perhaps most importantly, the ways in which the tale has been told and retold, expressed and suppressed by Hopis, Native American activists, and others over the last 3 centuries. It's the story of about the question of who ought to own the past, and one that suggests a more nuanced explanation for communal violence. Okay, so that's the scholarly aspect. What I also wanted to emphasize is where James comes from institutionally. He's had historical positions in history departments at the University of Maryland, the University of California, Santa Barbara, UC Berkeley, Institute for Advanced Study, et cetera, et cetera. But he's here today as president and CEO of the School for Advanced Research on the Human Experience in Santa Fe, New Mexico. That the school was established in 1907 as a study for the archaeology and ethnology of the American Southwest. And since 1967, the scope of the school's activities have embraced a global perspective through programs to encourage advanced scholarship in anthropology and related social science disciplines and the humanities, and especially to facilitate the work of Native American scholars and artists. So it has an extensive campus, 30 staff members, et cetera, et cetera. The school realizes its mission through an array of programs, including fellowships for scholars and residents, week-long gatherings of scholars, prizes, residential fellowships for Native American artists, and the SAR Press, which publishes a great deal of scholarly books of note in the field, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I'm cutting short, but I think the School for Advanced Research exemplifies a kind of exciting and productive inter- or transdisciplinarity spanning the arts, the humanities, and the social sciences that I think can serve as an inspiration for us here at Carnegie Mellon and at the Center for the Arts and Society. Most important for the topic at hand today, I'm finally getting to it, it's your fault that I have to talk so long and so much, is SAR's Indian Arts Research Center, one of the world's most significant collections of Southwest Native American arts and artifacts, founded in 1922 and spanning the 450-year period from the Spanish period of Spanish contact and conquest to the present. And as president of the School for Advanced Research, James Brooks has not only transformed the school in exciting ways into a dynamic and cutting-edge institution, but one of the ways he has done so over the past 5 years, as I'm sure we'll learn today, is in transforming the nature and purpose of the Indian Arts Research Center through ambitious outreach to Native communities who have become actively involved in the sector. James Brooks' talk today is entitled, once again, Connecting with Indigenous Communities through Indigenous Art Collections.
Wow, you did it. Thank you, Paul. That was quite spectacular and incredibly boring, right? Like, oh, I don't want to hear this guy go on and on and on. But no, it's really wonderful that Paul welcomed me here. I was going to be in Pittsburgh anyway, doing what I really do at SAR, which is raise money daily, every day, to keep the doors open. And I thought, wait, I know people in Pittsburgh, and how about I come and visit and all? And he said, oh, I'm running this center. Why don't you come and give a talk about Indian arts? I said, well, I don't know anything about Indian arts. All I do is run this place, right? But that's the secret to administrators, is in fact we know nothing about what we administer. But if you're good as an administrator, you hire really good people who do know what they're doing. And that's a lot of what I want to talk about today. I'm just going to give you a quick story about kind of where this collection comes from. We have nearly 13,000 pieces of absolutely the best Southwest Native art from the time of contact up until the present. The collection continues to grow. We have a strong emphasis on contemporary 21st century art, and you'll get a sense of that. But it's got a history, and it's a history that began, now over 100 years ago, and that has gone through a lot of changes. And I think actually it gives us an opportunity to look at kind of the history of anthropology, the history of art collecting, the history of the relationship between indigenous peoples and we who study them. and this gradual arc toward empowerment and the engagement of Indigenous peoples in the stewardship and the curation and the management of these collections. So that's why I came up with this kind of tongue-twisting, but I think very poetic title. It is a little hard to roll out. Well, that didn't do anything. There we go. This is where I work. It's kind of nice. It's I was really glad that I chose this slide to show off. This is the administration building where my office is located. And I took this a year and a day ago. It was the first snow that we had had in Santa Fe. And I just heard from my kids this morning that we had our first snow last night in Santa Fe. So the timing was perfect. And as you can see, we had both leaves on the trees turning yellow and some snow on the ground. The building you see there was originally a residence. I'll tell you something about that residence. It's modeled on the mission church at Laguna Pueblo, which is west of Albuquerque, about 40 miles. It's about a 75% scale model of that mission church, precise to every detail. The corbels, the latilla, there's a herringbone latilla pattern in the ceiling that's reproduced. And so there's kind of this immediate architectural connection to the very communities that we're attempting to engage with now and whose artistic production we have the honor of stewarding. As Paul mentioned, we now are one of what we hope to be one of the leading centers for advanced study in social sciences, humanities, and the indigenous arts. This is just a quick snapshot of some of the things we've done in the last 12 months. In the upper left, we have an active publishing program. We publish about a dozen titles a year that flow either through the scholarly programs of the school. We produce a series called the Advanced Seminar Series that's now 42 years old. And if you are a self-respecting anthropologist, you really kind of have to have all of these edited volumes, or we hope. This is what's called niche dominance. I really like that because, like, when we produce a book, if you're going to stay current, you kind of got to buy it if you're like, and that makes us happy. But we also produce books for the general popular audience. This is David Grant Noble's most recent book. He's done several for us. In the Places of Spirits, it's a combination memoir, archaeological memoir of his explorations in the Southwest, and the first time he has ever linked that to his own photography. He's a spectacular photographer. And this is one aspect of the mission of SAR that I really embrace, and it drives me crazy every day, but I love it every day. And that was when the school was founded by Edgar Lee Hewitt 104 years ago. He wrote a mission statement that not only were we going to support the advanced study, especially in American archaeology, produce a cadre of professionals who could rival the professional class working in the Mediterranean, but we also had the mandate to communicate that knowledge to the general public, or the interested public, as we now call it. We decided not to try to reach the general public because they don't care, but there is an interested public out there. Makes it a lot easier. And this is a constant struggle, and I think everyone here probably knows that it is not easy to translate the kinds of esoteric knowledge produced by scholars to even an interested public. It's a real challenge, but it's one that we embrace. One of my favorite stories, though, is one of the first trustees of SAR back in 1907 was Franz Boas, a rather spectacular big name in anthropology. Once this mission statement was adopted, he resigned in protest because he said, you can't do both. You cannot support the best anthropological scholarship and reach the general public. He said, you're going to dumb down everything you do if you do that. And so here's one of the great grandfathers, one of the founding fathers of American anthropology, who said, you can't do it, and we've been doing it for 104 years. So we're very happy with that. In the center, you have Purnima Paidapati from the University of Chicago. She was with us this summer working on a history of military ethnography in northern India, how the tribal zones of northern India were constructed through British military ethnographers. On the right are 5 of our resident scholars who are with us this year for a 9-month residencies, including on the far right there a new fellow that we've just brought in under a new fellowship that we launched this year. Jamila Bargash is from Morocco, and she is the first Campbell Fellow working in what we call women's economic empowerment, the anthropology of economic development. And she works on this astonishing, I want to know if anybody has heard of this, fog harvesting technology in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. That these mountains every night get these amazing fog banks rolling in as the heat of the Sahara sucks the moisture in off the ocean. The fog builds up, and she's building these very simple nets of propylene nets outside these villages that catch the fog, and then they come down into overnight collection systems. And 2 or 3 of these net systems that are only like 140 square feet or something put together can supply fresh water daily for women who usually have to walk 3 or 4 miles a day to the village wells in order to get it. So we have that kind of very applied aspects going on. Others, and I'm not going to walk through everybody there, but on the left you have Melissa Nelson, who is Turtle Mountain Chippewa. She's working on the reconstruction and preservation of the Paiute Salt Song Trail. The Paiutes have historically traveled ceremonially 1,000-mile trail in the Great Basin in order to mark their own kind of ontological emergence narrative. And there were songs that went in tandem with this 1,000-mile trail. She's been working now for about a decade with the Paiutes to preserve these songs both digitally and in performance. And so she's with us to help bring those back to the Paiutes as they're completed, and to Paiute youth especially. We also host Native artists. This is Marla Allison. She is from Laguna Pueblo, where one of our buildings is modeled. She's a painter, but she came to us as a fellow. Specifically, she said, I want to paint, but I want to paint inspired by the pottery of my own pueblo. And so here she is with the Acoma Laguna, a very small portion of the Acoma Laguna collection, holding one of our earliest Laguna pots, and behind her are 2 panels of what was ultimately a 4-panel painting that she did, where she picked up some of the design motifs out of the pottery and put them into, this is a landscape view of the red mesas around Laguna Pueblo Village. So she's folding together landscape and design elements into a single piece of work. And Marla is one of these just emerging young artists that is going to be really exciting to watch. She's also a super ninja warrior. She participates in all sorts of martial arts and is quite apparently celebrated for that. But a really delightful person. And then on the left is a seminar that we just hosted in June. That seminars are usually thought of as being kind of staid and kind of bow tie kinds of things. This is a seminar that celebrated the 100th year of the passing of Catherine Dunham, who was an anthropologist and a dancer, much more renowned as a dancer, and ran the Dunham School in East St. Louis. But during her whole career as Catherine Dunham, she kind of quietly published in anthropology as Kay Dunn. And she's really known as the first person to come and create an anthropology of dance, looking at dance as cultural expression and performance. And so these are all both academics and simultaneously dancers who came together. And not only did they do the classic seminar of exchanging papers and talking about them and all, but they also they led a master class for Santa Fe youth at the National Dance Institute in Santa Fe and taught the Dunham technique for a day. So this is it gives you a sense of the kind of outreach that we're trying to do to reach new people in the community. But to go back to the beginning, and this is important in terms of the collection, we were established by Edgar Lee Hewitt in 1907 as the School of American Archaeology, specifically to create a cohort of professional archaeologists who would investigate the archaeological wonders of the Southwest and keep the stuff here. What Hewitt saw happening, and was happening by 1907, was that archaeologists of the classical world in Europe and almost Europe, meaning Harvard to him, were coming into the Southwest and basically pot hunting these archaeological sites in order to get the pottery, especially, well, here's a piece of biscuitware. And Hewitt wanted the stuff to stay in New Mexico, to stay in the Southwest, and he thought that our archaeological wonders were every bit as important as those of the classical world. So he founds the School of American Archaeology. This is Bandelier National Monument. The guy in the dark is Edgar Lee Hewitt himself. They're beginning to excavate up in what are called the cavates. You can see an aerial view of Chionyi, which is one of the major pueblos there. And of course, it's now a national monument where we get about 250,000 visitors a year going up and hiking the canyons. And this is the first of 4 ladders, 140 feet up into the canyon to get to a place called Ceremonial Cave. But what the school is doing archaeology, and especially in this period, archaeology meant digging stuff up and putting it in collections. This is kind of how we began to get into the collections business. It also created, right out the gate, a somewhat difficult relationship because indigenous peoples in the Southwest weren't exactly thrilled to have white archaeologists running around digging up all their burials, right? Because where you're going to find the best stuff, the pottery that's preserved and not broken, or the pahos, the prayer sticks, the jewelry and whatnot, are associated with burials. So here we are in 1907, we're already in the grave robbing business. And that's going to come to be an issue. By the 1970s, we've expanded and we've become the School of American Research at that point. We were supporting global scholarship, but we were also running our own continuing archaeological investigations. This is the site of Arroyo Hondo Pueblo, which is just a few miles south of Santa Fe. You can see in the aerial photograph the mounds of the room blocks here. This is an aerial photograph of our excavations that were ongoing throughout the 1970s, supported by the National Geographic Society, National Science Foundation, NEH. This was the most extensive and thorough multi-year archaeological research project for any single site in the Southwest. We've now produced 9 volumes of scholarly analysis, everything from faunal remains to pottery to organic materials to the architecture, space syntax, everything out of this site. And here you see a reconstruction of what this is. It was about 1,000 rooms, probably had at its maximum residents of 400 or 500 indigenous ancestral Puebloan peoples. And of course, a lot of pottery. This is a classic Santa Fe black on white piece that came out of that. At the end of the excavations, we had 325,000 specifically tagged and inventoried items that came out of this. And it was a really, really important project for the archaeological knowledge that we were able to produce from it. That each of these plazas, it's an interesting story, that the very top plaza is the first plaza, and then over periods of 3 to 5 years, new plazas are added, and it's all by people, new people, immigrant people, coming in and joining and growing this community. It seems like that's a pretty neat story of them coming together. What we also did was an extensive investigation of the regional sustaining area in terms of the capacity to grow corn and beans and squash, the wild game available, everything from deer to rabbits to mice sort of thing. And we realized that by the time those 3rd and 4th and 5th plazas are being added, the people had well exceeded the sustaining capacity of the region. And when people started looking at the nearly 300 individual human remains that we took out of this site, you could see osteologically that every new immigrating group of people were increasingly malnourished and stressed, to the point that the children being born in some of those later plazas are being born with rickets. They're being born malnourished. Right? This was not a happy place in the last generation of its occupation. And that's part of one of the challenges that confronted us, because I mentioned, we took nearly 300 people out of this, and we housed them at SAR. And we had a repository that housed these 325,000 objects plus 300 people or so. And when it came to our relationships with, I don't want to go there, with indigenous people, this, although we never were public in any major way about the fact that we had this huge collection, it was a research collection and all. But Indian country knew that their relatives were being housed on this campus. And when I became president, there had been, we were entirely compliant with NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. We had reported all of our holdings, cataloged them, made them public so claimant communities could come. One of the challenges for us was that no contemporary Pueblo community made a claim on Arroyo Hondo as being ancestral, which meant we had no community to work with in terms of the repatriation and reburial process. When I became president, we were then confronted with how are we going to deal with this? So we do not want to have these human remains on our campus anymore because, one, we're done, the analysis is done, and besides, it's presenting a real issue of comfort for our Indian neighbors. And so luckily, we were able to work out an agreement with Zia Pueblo, the folks that were physically the closest community, they're in between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, to act as a consulting group for us. And we went through almost a year-long process of working with the cultural preservation officers at Zia Pueblo and spiritual advisors from that Pueblo, some of the elders there, to how do we manage the process of reburying the citizens of Arroyo Hondo Pueblo. We went through, it was a long and complicated preparation process, and then finally the day came and the site had been prepared, and I physically put every one of those people back in the ground. We had really deep trenches, and the trenches were so unstable once we got below the caliche that I really was making me nervous about having anybody down there. So what I did is, over the course of a rather long day, is I rode the backhoe bucket up and down, carrying these people and putting them back where they belong. So that was one really important step that we went through, and it was a big relief to me, to everyone at SAR, and to our indigenous constituents who we want to work with. So that kind of gives you a sense of the archaeological background. There's also the story of our patrons who gave us this campus, and I hope this kind of looks familiar. That this is that very same building that you saw in that first photograph, pretty much the day it was completed in 1927. This is an estate that was named by its creators, El Delirio, the madness, or our madness. And it started out as 350 acres. It's now 8 acres. They basically bought the whole east side of Santa Fe and developed that. But one of them, who you'll meet in a moment, served on our board of trustees for nearly 40 years. And when she passed on in 1972, the El Delirio estate became the campus for SAR. We had been downtown in a building near the Palace of the Governors, and suddenly we had this like campus. But this is how it began, and these owners were interesting women. Amelia and Martha Root White had come to Santa Fe in the early 20s in an open touring car, driving across the country in order to view a total eclipse of the sun on the Pacific coast. After several weeks, I think, of driving in an open touring car, their hair was a mess, so they stopped in Santa Fe to have their hair done. So goes the story. And they fell in love with Santa Fe, and they became part of this phenomenon of young, wealthy white women who flocked to the Southwest in the early decades of the 20th century, because the Southwest represented some kind of an alternative, especially for women, to the kinds of transformations that were going on in the United States at this time. They saw Native communities, Pueblo people, especially Pueblo women, living what seemed to them to be much more empowered lives, engaging in lives where they had the respect of their community. And so Santa Fe became this mecca for highly kind of experimental white women to come and have fun. And boy, did they have a lot of fun. As you can see, this is Amelia on her horse, preparing to ride in the Santa Fe Fiesta Parade. Next to her on the right we have Amelia on the far left and Martha on the far right. And Paul, being a Mayanist, surely you recognize the sacrificial attire that they're dressed in here. Does anybody want to guess what's going on here on that platform? They are sacrificing the Virgin in order to celebrate the completion of Santa Fe's first swimming pool. And that's what's behind that adobe wall, is basically a concrete tub that's about like 18 feet long, 4 feet deep, and 10 feet wide. And that is the first swimming pool that Santa Fe ever had. And they inaugurated it with a cenote de sacrifice, where they tossed this virginal maiden in to mark, and it's like today, it just kind of makes you cringe to imagine they're doing this. But they had and they were totally connected. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald hung out at El Delirio. The Lindberghs hung out at El Delirio. We even have an aerial photo that Charles Lindbergh took as he zoomed the estate. We also had the first tennis court in Santa Fe, and we still do. It's the only clay court in New Mexico. We still have to keep that up, even though none of us play tennis. So here are these two powerful kinds of social and artistic movers coming to Santa Fe, and one of the things that gets their interest is the fate of Indian art. By the early 1920s, they are participating in and creating something that is called the Indian Arts Fund, which ultimately will become the collection that you'll be seeing shortly. The way this story goes is that Amelia and Martha were at a party at an estate up in Tesuque Village, north of Santa Fe, and they partied a lot. And at this party, people had bought pottery, next to the railroad and all. And this pot was featured at the party. It's an Ashiwi polychrome jar from Zuni Pueblo, dated to about 1780. And apparently somebody got into their martinis and somebody dropped the pot, and it shattered. And there was this kind of collective stunned moment where the people gathered at the party realized that this was a moment when this beautiful artistic tradition was headed toward its passing, because Indian potters had stopped making these spectacular big vessels and were beginning to produce really tiny little pots you could sell down to the railroad tracks for a nickel or a dime. And so Amelia and Martha and their friends created the Indian Arts Fund specifically to go out and purchase and preserve in perpetuity the best of the best of Southwest Native artistry. Specifically, it started with pottery and then expanded into textiles and other media. They hired Ken Chapman, who is kind of a legendary ceramics expert, to be their advisor. Ken was not professionally trained in any way other than he was an artist himself, but he really became a student of the art form. Here on the upper left, he is with Maria Martinez herself from San Ildefonso Pueblo, who becomes one of the truly legendary potters in the Southwest. He was their curator for this collection. And to give you an idea of just how awkward this relationship is from our perspective today, what they wanted was the best of the best, right? They wanted to preserve in their collections the epic moment. And so Ken Chapman would go out to San Ildefonso Pueblo, and Maria would line up, there's 6 or 8 or 10 pots that she had made, and he would walk along with a stick and he would systematically break them. He'd say, nah, not good enough, not good enough. He'd say, this one. And he'd give her $5. And then he'd break, and he'd say, when what Ken was doing was creating an aesthetic. He was saying, this is what I believe to be the finest of your artistic production, and I will continue to give you $5 a pot as long as you can continue to make this kind of quality of work. So, looking back, you kind of, you cringe, and quite publicly, it's like, this is awful. And yet, at the same time that they're creating this collection, the sisters are also hosting the first ever public art show of Southwest Arts in Santa Fe at the Armory, where you have hundreds of the best of different kinds of artistic traditions represented there. They, because of their connections, anybody know who the White was that they might have been connected to? That Horace Mann White, the publisher of the Chicago Tribune and the New York Post, was their father. And so they had these connections to back east. When they host an art show, everybody turns out, because Scott and Zelda's going to be there, Charles and Ann are going to be there. They single-handedly drive and create a market for something that had never had a kind of a cash market before. And so at the same time that they're doing this, incredibly patronizing, condescending kind of aesthetic curation of an art form that had never been intended to be, aimed at this kind of a market, they're also, literally, they are rescuing and creating a demand for high-quality arts that, continues today. That's how we get into the business of having a collection. And this is what that Indian Arts Fund became at SAR. This is a shot into one of 2 what are literally, we call them vaults, and they are vaults. The walls around these are, 3 or 4 feet thick. They're reinforced with all sorts of concrete, rebar. The doors to entry of these are classic bank vault doors, that I can't get into because they never tell me any of the codes to allow me in, but luckily we have got people who will when I ask. And here we have in Vault 1 on the bottom floor about 7,000 pieces of pottery. And it is the best of the best. Okay, this was the curation and the accession tradition that Chapman established. And it's organized first by language, family, and then by Pueblo. And what you see here is kind of on the left, how the collection in some ways was used for many years, and that was simply to shock and awe. It was a great place to bring my donors, right, my visitors, and I always say, hey, you want to see something really nice? And you open the bank vault, and they go, oh, the jaws drop, because it's all open storage. There's no vitrines, there's no nothing. It's like this stuff is just sitting out there. You have 7,000 or 8,000 pieces of pottery. We have hundreds of pieces of basketry, 735 of the best Navajo textiles that are out there, more than 600 katsinas, the Hopi and Zuni kokos in that collection. It is an astonishing thing. What's great about the picture on the left is it was only shot in August. And what we're seeing here is Native peoples from the communities that produced this work acting as interpreters for this event that we hosted for trustees and our people, and I'll help you get to there. So this is how shock and awe might have looked, but in fact what you're seeing here is an entirely different experience. There's not a white curator telling the story of this stuff. You got Jay Garcia here in the background from Santa Clara Pueblo. He's talking about his own work and the work that we have in the center that inspired him to do the kind of work that he's doing today. So this is a pretty exciting transformation and process. How did we get there? And this is where I get to take a little credit. I was really fortunate within my first couple of years of stepping into the job to know that there were some very good and incredibly talented Native professionals that were coming up and into the job market. I hired Dr. Cynthia Chavez Lamar back in 2007. She had done her training. She had a doctorate from UNM, University of New Mexico, in cultural studies. She had done her training at NMAI in DC. She was the curator, if you've been there, of the exhibit called Our Lives, which was a collaborative curation project of looking at contemporary Indian communities and their artistic production across hemispherically. We have peoples from Chile and all the way up into Alaska represented there. She was the curator of that, and she was therefore from the very beginning really committed to collaborative and consultative relationships with the very communities who were represented there. She is from San Felipe Pueblo, so she's one of the Rio Grande peoples, but she's also, in her typical kind of complicated family ways that we see so much down there, she's also connected to Hopi Tewa out at Polaca and Navajo as well. So she has the capacity to connect with a lot of different communities. And as she says, listen, if I can get along with myself, then all you other Indians ought to be able to get along too, because they're not always happy relationships and those different things. Laura Eliff we brought in as collections manager. She's Choctaw. She has a degree in anthropology from, I think it's Southern Illinois University, as well as a continued training in collections care and management. And she is right now, we're supporting her in pursuing her own doctorate at UNM in the same American Studies, the Cultural Studies program that Dr. Chavez Lamar went through. Sylvanus Paul is a Rama Navajo. He's our collections assistant, and he did his undergraduate training at Diné College, and then went on to do some more training up at Fort Lewis College in Durango. And Sylvanus, he's absolutely the best textiles guy because he grew up with Navajo textiles. He grew up in a weaving community. He's fluent in Navajo. He's able, when we bring the grandmothers in for these collections visit, there's someone there who knows the cultural protocols for helping them come in and understand it and enjoy the collection. So indigenizing the staff was a really important first step, and everything that has flowed subsequently really is to their credit. We have always had for nearly 40 years in Native artist residencies, but with Cynthia and her staff coming in, it began to get really fun and exciting because not only do you have people like Sherry Farrell Russett, Métis from Canada, we're suddenly outside of the Southwest, we're outside of the national borders, working in a fairly traditional form. She's beading here, but she's also a writer, an illustrator, children's book author, and an academic. So she's mixing and matching all sorts of different perspectives. She was with us a year ago. Elijah Naranjo here in the middle at the top is the daughter of Nora Naranjo Morse, one of the really legendary artists in the Southwest. But Elijah didn't want to be a potter. She wanted to be a painter, but she wanted to do something different. So what she did is use the collection to inspire her to work in a new media of painting. She's painting with clay. All of her pigments are derived from the very clay that is used throughout the collection in producing pots, but instead she uses it as a paint. You have a Choctaw guy, Jeff Gibson, here on the right. He was inspired by looking at the weavings in the collection to play with weaving motifs in a very contemporary and abstract style. That's a painting behind him there, where he's picking up on some of the notions of the warp and the weft that he's seeing in these traditional Navajo rugs, but doing something entirely different with it. And Jeff, lives in New York, shows in New York, very edgy, contemporary guy, but able to make that leap between tradition and innovation. We have here Cedar Sherbert, filmmaker, brought in completely. People are going, what? How come Indians make film? He's a screenwriter. He's working on he's California Indian, working on a screenplay there. Erica Lord is Alaskan Native. She does performance art, very, very fun, different kinds of stuff, and is a very playful person. And even Pat Courtney Gold here on the left, Washoe basket maker, also used to teach up at the community college there in computer skills, so she's very adept in contemporary media. But what she did is take some of her materials from Oregon, the Washoe country, and also then mix them with Southwestern materials and got into producing these huge wall hanging pieces. So she's not like making a little traditional basket all the time. She's really innovating and pushing the edges. We also brought in communities, invited them to come and to help us to understand the collection. This is Jim Enote, who's the director of the Shiwi Awan Museum at Zuni Pueblo. And Jim came over because we had, as you can see, this is just a sampling of our Zuni pots here. Hundreds of Zuni pots, but we noticed in the collections records of 30-some pieces, if I remember right, that were designated pseudo-ceremonial. And we thought, what's going on here? We got to be really careful about this because we should not have out for public display pottery that is truly ceremonial in nature. And so Jim came over and looked at this stuff, and in fact began to identify that maybe some of these were a little problematic. But what in the center here was most fascinating because first, if you look at it in the top, Jim looks at it, and okay, so we have the steppe cloud motif, we have the fertility motifs, we have a lot of stuff in there that would suggest that this was probably a kiva bowl and probably should not, be something that is out there. But then you look inside, and Jim kind of laughs, and he says, well, no, I don't think so, because kiva bowls are for making a foodstuff that can be shared ceremonially. And he says, well, no, that's not going to work with that frog down in the bottom. You're not going to be able to And so what we found is that these pseudo-ceremonials were a genre that traders specifically asked Zuni potters to make in the 20s and 30s because they knew that there was a fascination among collectors about these ceremonial objects. And so they'd go out and say, can you make us a ceremonial pot, kiva pot that we can sell? And the Zunis would say, sure, no problem. And yet they would kind of quietly find ways of not, kind of subverting the ceremonial nature of it by adding a frog or something, or in this case, adding a hole that's not going to work very well for doing food in the kivas. So it was a great consultation because we were able to distinguish between those of a truly ceremonial nature and those that were produced specifically for the tourist trade, and yet the Zuni potters were able to kind of protect themselves from sharing any critical ceremonial knowledge. There also came out of this consultation a really exciting breakthrough where Jim was there and he sees this ring, the pot ring, in the upper left corner in our collection. He says, what is that? I don't know what's going on with that. And as he studies and thinks about it, he thinks about the Zuni Oya maidens who have been dancing for millennia with these pots on their heads. And he says, wait a minute, I think what those rings are is that they used to be made to help carry the pot on your head. He says, we don't do that anymore. That our Oya maidens have to dance with it like, and it's not. So what Jim was able to do was to go back to the Pueblo, find a weaver who had some kind of vague recollection of how these might have been made, and they come back to SAR with materials. These are yucca leaves from the inside of a very, very special, very narrow leaf yucca plant. And they work and find out you can weave it by putting it around like a tin can. You can help shape it, right? And through this process, Jim is able basically to rebirth a whole weaving tradition out at Zuni Pueblo. They're now teaching Zuni potters and Zuni kids how to produce these pot rings that he had not even seen ever in his own life. So this is one of those really successful moments where, by committing ourselves to these conversations with our indigenous communities, we're able to really give back in positive ways. We also hosted a seminar a couple of years ago. We had 53 pairs of moccasins in our collection that were not really well documented at all. So we brought in moccasin makers from 6 different communities: Apaches, Pueblos, Zunis, and all throughout the Southwest. And we looked at these systematic and carefully, and actually are now developing. Cynthia Chavez is working on a traveling exhibit that will talk about this process, as well as all of these moccasin makers made moccasins based on many of these old designs. But a classic example of how we can learn from these consultations is represented in these 2 photographs. The upper one is how we had these Apache moccasins stored and displayed in our collection for many, many, many years. And the Apaches kind of looked at it and said, what are you guys doing there? What they explained to us was, in fact, they're supposed to be rolled down in such a way that you can see this is the way they're supposed to be preserved and worn then. And so through this consultation, we were able to go, whoops, we're not doing that right. And now we can display those moccasins in the perfectly appropriate way. And it's been great because it's really inspired these moccasin makers to get re-engaged in making these. And so we'll be doing this new exhibit in the years ahead. We also committed ourselves to youth. We created in the last few years a Native internship program that brings Native students who are post-BA and thinking about professional careers in heritage and museum management, but who need some kind of a transition period between their finishing their undergraduate work and deciding exactly in which direction they want to go in professional training. And so we have on the upper left Jessica Metcalf, Turtle Mountain Chippewa, who was our first intern, Branniger intern, came a couple of 3 years ago. Jessica now has finished her doctorate at the University of Arizona in American Indian Studies and is holding a postdoc at the University of New Mexico. She works on Native fashion design, the history of Native fashion design for the last 100 years or so, from like Lloyd Kiva New, who was a very early Native fashion designer, up until today, the very, very edgy, crazy stuff that Virgil Ortiz from Cochiti Pueblo does. So here, this was our first intern who actually took this and really launched and moved ahead on it. Gloria Bell, who's Métis from Canada, is working on digital. She's with us this year, digital curation of Métis clothing. We have Dominic Henry on the far right, who is Diné. He's finishing a doctorate now at the University of Oklahoma. He was really fascinated with Maya work, and so he curated a digital exhibit with us on Maya ceramics and the body in general. He was really fascinated with the way that Maya people represented the human body. This year as well, we have Teresa Montoya here. She's Navajo Diné as well. And she's working with some contemporary Navajo weavers who are actually men, which is very unusual. And she's kind of looking around at graduate schools. I got to go and write her some letters for grad schools when I get back. Olivia Merimejo from Picoris Pueblo is actually a high school student. She's just finishing high school. She came to us from the Santa Fe Indian School. She too is looking ahead and wondering a good track for her career. And finally, Kendall Talmadge here is Ho Chunk from Wisconsin, and she has just begun a combination PhD and museum studies program at the University of Colorado. So we're bringing in these young students who really are using that year with us as a way of learning about how to, the fundamentals of collections management, but also the intellectual work of becoming a scholar. Cynthia Chavez, during her training, had realized there was something insidious going on with Native students. They were kind of getting tracked into the kind of the vocational technical side of the museum trade, registrar, collections management, that sort of thing, collections care. They weren't being encouraged to pursue the intellectual side, to become academics and thinkers themselves. This program was specifically designed to help move that forward. We also have an ongoing partnership with the Santa Fe Indian School that is owned by the Pueblos and has a large residential program. A lot of Indian kids come in. And they come and spend time with us, again, learning in the kind of the beginning levels how to research in a collection, how to examine, how to sketch, how to record the work that goes on. And so we're catching and getting kids involved very early on. And finally, just moving into other kinds of partnerships we always kind of had, like, the scholars did seminars and Indians did convocations, right? Because it was like arts and it was scholarship. We now do Native artist seminars by saying, hey, you guys, you are thinkers and dreamers in your own right, and so gather your people together and let's do really thoughtful scholarly work. You drive it, you figure out what the urgent topics are, and take it from here. And so you have Nora Naranjo Morse involved in a seminar that also included the Ainu activist from Japan, Miriam Chaikin, who came over and participated as a performance artist in looking at the notion of indigeneity, identity, and aesthetics. We have a collection here of nearly a dozen Native artists, women from Canada and the United States, who came together and produced this book that we just launched a couple of months ago, Art in Our Lives, Native Women Artists in Dialogue, where they're really looking at the role of Native women, one, as kind of culturally conservative players. They're supposed to conserve and maintain traditions, and yet at the same time are pushing, because they're artists, they want to experiment and play and find new modes of expression. And the kind of pushback that they get in those roles, both from the collecting community that wants to see Native women being traditional, and from their own communities that may not want to see Native women in these highly experimental and innovative modes. And so we continue to play with this as ways of really reinforcing the kind of the combination and simultaneity of artistic expression and intellectual engagement that all of our Native constituents bring to it. This is a book that I did with Gloria Emerson, a Navajo painter who also I discovered was an extraordinary poet. And so we worked together, and I served as the developmental editor on this publication, where people were going, whoa, you got a Navajo woman who not only can paint in these really strange and wonderful abstract forms, but also writes beautiful poetry that combines Navajo and English in a single poem. So that's my talk for this evening. It gives you a sense of how this collection has changed over the last 100 years or so. And I'm happy to take questions. And thank you very much.